July 12, 1944. The desert outside Florence, Arizona, shimmered like a sea of glass beneath the sun. A train slowed to a halt, its wheels screeching softly as dust clouds curled into the air. Inside the cars, dozens of Japanese prisoners sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the dry horizon. They had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from the Pacific coast after surrendering on the island of Saipan, and now they waited to see what their enemy looked like when not holding a rifle. Corporal Masaru Takahashi pressed his face against the metal slats of the train window. He was 30 years old, born in Yokohama, once a schoolteacher before the war. The desert looked endless to him, a place without life, without sound. When the door finally opened, the burst of hot air felt like the breath of an oven. An American sergeant shouted for them to step down. The prisoners obeyed quietly, blinking against the white light. They expected brutality. Every rumor they had heard said that Americans beat prisoners, mocked them, starved them, yet the first thing that greeted them was a faint smell of cut grass and, strangely, fried food drifting from somewhere behind a wooden gate. Ahead stood a painted sign, Camp Florence, U.S. Army Prisoner War Camp. Below it, in smaller letters, Welcome, keep clean. Masaru read it twice. Welcome? He thought it must be a trick of translation. The camp looked more like a small town than a prison. Rows of wooden barracks stood neatly in order, each with a small garden plot. There were water towers, guard towers, and in the distance, what appeared to be a baseball field. Everything was organized, almost peaceful. The Americans who guarded them were young, many barely out of high school. They wore clean uniforms, not the mud-streaked khaki of the front lines. Some even smiled. Lieutenant Samuel Reed, the camp's officer on duty that afternoon, observed the new arrivals with cautious curiosity. He was 27, from Iowa, a former high school history teacher, before being drafted. His orders were simple. Process the new prisoners, issue them uniforms, feed them, and maintain discipline. But as he watched the men step off the train in silence, thin, sunburned, eyes cast down, he felt something tighten in his chest. They looked less like enemies and more like men who had lost their place in the world. Each prisoner received a numbered tag, a canvas uniform stamped PW, and a towel with a bar of soap. When one of them hesitated, uncertain about what to do, an interpreter explained in halting Japanese, "These are for you, Washington rest." Then food. Masaru turned the towel over in his hands. It was soft, smelling faintly of detergent. In the Imperial Army, towels were rationed and soap was a luxury. Here, it was given freely. The gesture confused him more than comforted him. He whispered to the man beside him, "Private Kenji Morimoto, perhaps they wish to clean us before the cameras." Kenji shrugged. Perhaps they want to mock us for being dirty. Their American escort, a broad-shouldered guard named Reed, the lieutenant himself, walked alongside them toward the barracks. "You'll be fed soon," he said evenly. "Follow the line. No trouble, you'll be fine." His Japanese was broken but earnest. Masaru understood most of it and nodded. It startled him to hear courtesy from an enemy. Inside the barracks, the air smelled of pine and soap. The floors were swept clean. Each bunk had a mattress, blanket, and pillow. It was more than many Japanese soldiers had seen in years. A calendar on the wall showed an image of a smiling American family beside a red car. Beneath it, in bold letters, "Freedom is worth protecting." That word, freedom, hung in Masaru's mind. He had been taught that the Americans fought for greed and comfort, that they had no discipline, no spirit. Yet this camp, though surrounded by barbed wire, carried a strange sense of order and abundance. At dusk, the prisoners were marched to the mess hall. The building buzzed with sound. Trays sliding, voices murmuring, and the faint crackle of a radio playing a tune Masaru had never heard before. The song was cheerful with horns and a steady beat. Later, he would learn it was Benny Goodman. The smell of cooked meat filled the room. When the food was placed on his tray, Masaru stared in disbelief. Real bread, thick slices of roast beef, boiled potatoes, and a cup of something cold and white. It steamed slightly in the dry air. He turned to the interpreter. "What is this?" The interpreter smiled. "Dinner. That white thing is called mashed potatoes. You eat it with this." He handed him a spoon. Masaru had used chopsticks all his life. The spoon felt awkward in his hand, heavy and round. He scooped a small portion and tasted it. It was buttery, soft, and unfamiliar. It did not taste of war. Across the table, Kenji hesitated, then copied him. "They feed prisoners like guests," he muttered. "Maybe tomorrow they feed us poison." A few American guards overheard and laughed lightly, though not cruelly. One of them said in English, "Don't worry, fellas. We ain't wasting poison on potatoes." Masaru didn't understand the words, but the tone was oddly warm. For a brief moment, he almost smiled. After dinner, the prisoners were led outside to the yard. The air had cooled. In the distance, some American soldiers were playing baseball under the fading light. Their laughter echoed across the compound. One of the guards explained to the interpreter, "Baseball, Americans love it." Masaru blinked. "We have baseball, too," he said quietly. "Before the war in school." The guard nodded, surprised. "Then you can play here. We have bats and gloves." The suggestion sounded absurd to both men, and yet it planted something fragile in the space between them, recognition that they shared something beyond uniforms and flags. That night, as Masaru lay on his bunk staring at the wooden ceiling, he tried to make sense of the day. His country had told him the Americans were heartless, yet the men he met today offered him soap, food, and conversation. Still, he could not trust it. In his mind, kindness from an enemy was a tactic, not truth. He thought of his wife back in Yokohama, of the bombings of his students. He wondered if they were safe. The desert wind pressed against the walls, carrying a faint scent of sage. Somewhere outside, an American guard was humming the same tune from the mess hall. Lieutenant Reed sat at his desk that evening, writing the day's report. "Received new Japanese prisoners," he wrote. "Behavior, calm, disciplined, quiet. Condition, fatigued but cooperative. No incidents." Then he paused, tapping his pen. He added, almost as an afterthought, "Seemed confused by kindness." He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Reed had been raised to believe that mercy was not weakness, but duty. His brother was still fighting in the Pacific. The thought often gnawed at him. How strange it was that while one Reed fought the Japanese with bullets, the other offered them blankets and bread. Yet he felt that both were serving the same idea, that America should remain civilized, even when the world was not. The next morning, as the sun rose over the desert, Masaru and the others were assigned work details: kitchen duty, laundry, maintenance. Masaru volunteered for the library because he had once been a teacher. Inside, he discovered shelves of English books, many about America itself, its history, its presidents, even novels. He could not read the words yet, but he traced his fingers across the titles, feeling the smooth spines. An American sergeant noticed and asked, through the interpreter, if he wanted to borrow one to practice. Masaru nodded. That evening, he sat by the barracks window, turning the pages slowly, whispering the letters under his breath. As days passed, the camp's routine settled like a quiet rhythm. Roll call at dawn, work through midday, meals at set hours, and lights out by 10. The men remained wary, but tension slowly thinned. The guards treated them firmly, but not cruelly. Sometimes the Americans shared cigarettes through the wire, a silent gesture that said more than words. Still, mistrust lingered. When a guard laughed too loudly, Masaru flinched. When rations were delayed, rumors spread that punishment was coming. The past had taught them not to believe in generosity. But something small was changing. They began to notice details. How the guards addressed each other by first names. How they joked even with officers. How discipline here was built not on fear, but on habit. It was a different world, one that felt both alien and strangely inviting. One evening, Lieutenant Reed walked past the kitchen and stopped at the open door. Inside, a few prisoners were cleaning after dinner. A young cook was setting aside a pot of something white and creamy into a metal freezer box. "What's that?" Reed asked. The cook smiled. "Ice cream mix. Command want a batch ready for Sunday." Reed raised an eyebrow. "For the men or the prisoners?" The cook hesitated. "For both, sir. The colonel said it might boost morale." Reed chuckled softly. "Well, that'll be a sight. Outside, Masaru passed by, carrying a crate of dishes. He caught the word ice and cream, but did not understand their meaning. He only saw the American lieutenant smiling at the sound of it. That night, the desert air cooled again. Stars scattered across the sky like salt on black cloth. Inside the barracks, Masaru couldn't sleep. He thought about that strange phrase, ice cream. He didn't know it yet, but the taste of that word would soon challenge everything he believed about war, honor, and the people who once called him enemy. For now, he closed his eyes and listened to the wind brushing against the wire fence. It no longer sounded like a cage. It sounded almost like a whisper promising something he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, as history would quietly record, was when the real surprise began to melt its way into their lives. July 16, 1944. The air above Camp Florence shimmered as the temperature rose past 100 degrees. The desert cicadas buzzed like hidden machinery, and the smell of dust clung to every surface. Inside the camp's mess hall, large ceiling fans struggled to move the heavy air. Rows of Japanese prisoners stood quietly, trays in hand, waiting for breakfast. It was Sunday, and Sunday meant something different here. The Americans had decided to make ice cream. Corporal Masaru Takahashi didn't understand why this day felt more restless than others. Perhaps it was the way the guards seemed lighter in mood, humming as they worked. Perhaps it was the faint sweetness in the air, a smell he couldn't place. He was not alone in his curiosity. Around him, men whispered quietly, speculating. Some believed it was a celebration. Others thought it was another test, a new trick to measure their obedience. Lieutenant Samuel Reed stood near the serving line, watching. He had spent the early morning inspecting the ice cream machine, a heavy metal contraption borrowed from the Army Supply Depot in Phoenix. It looked out of place among the pots and pans, a small industrial miracle in the middle of the desert. The U.S. Army made ice cream wherever it could. There were even naval barges dedicated to producing it in the Pacific. It was a symbol of comfort, a taste of normal life for men far from home. Reed wondered what it might mean for prisoners who had never known such luxury. The cook, a cheerful man named Jenkins, handed him a spoon. "Tastes fine, sir. Vanilla, the good stuff." Reed took a small bite. It melted almost instantly in the heat, leaving behind a creamy sweetness. He smiled. "You realize they've probably never had this before?" Jenkins shrugged. "Then today's their lucky day." Masaru stepped forward when his turn came. The tray in his hands already held rice, bread, and a small slice of meat. Then, without warning, the cook scooped a perfect white mound onto a tin cup and slid it onto the tray. "Enjoy," Jenkins said brightly. Masaru stared at the white mound. It was soft and slowly losing shape. The cold vapor rising from it made it look alive. "What is this?" he asked the interpreter standing nearby. The interpreter, a Nisei soldier named Tanaka, smiled. "It's called ice cream. Sweet milk frozen with sugar. Americans love it." Masaru frowned. "Frozen milk? To eat?" "Yes. You like it?" He returned to his seat, setting the tray down carefully. Around him, the other prisoners were murmuring, poking at the unfamiliar substance with spoons. Some looked suspicious. One older soldier, Sergeant Ito, sniffed it and immediately recoiled. "It smells strange, like soap." Kenji Morimoto leaned in, amused. "Maybe it is soap. Maybe they're testing if we'll eat anything." Masaru hesitated. The ice cream was beginning to melt, forming small rivers across the tray. The sight fascinated him. The way it glistened, how it seemed to soften as if breathing. He scooped a small spoonful, hesitated again, then placed it in his mouth. The cold shocked him first. It was like swallowing snow. Then came the sweetness, rich, unfamiliar, almost overwhelming. His jaw stiffened. He closed his eyes. It was not unpleasant, only strange, impossibly smooth. When he opened his eyes, Kenji was watching him. "Well," Kenji asked. Masaru swallowed slowly. "It's cold." Kenji laughed softly and tried his own. His eyes widened, then narrowed. This could not be real food. He took another bite anyway. Across the hall, the same reactions rippled through the rows. Confusion gave way to curiosity, then faint amusement, For a few moments, the prisoners looked less like captives and more like students tasting something for the first time. Some laughed quietly. Others whispered that the Americans had too much comfort to know what real hunger was. Lieutenant Reed watched it unfold from a distance. He saw men who had been silent for weeks begin to speak. He saw tension dissolve in small, fragile smiles. One prisoner even asked for another serving, holding out his tray shyly. The cook gave him one without hesitation. Reed found himself smiling. It was a small victory, though he couldn't say for whom. When breakfast ended, the heat outside grew heavier. The prisoners returned to their barracks, talking in low voices about the strange food. Some carried faint traces of melted cream on their trays, licking them clean with quiet satisfaction. Masaru sat on the edge of his bunk, still tasting the faint sweetness on his tongue. He couldn't stop thinking about it. In his mind, the ice cream became something more than food. It was a symbol of contradiction. He remembered the propaganda poster from home, images of Americans as cruel, lazy men with hollow eyes. Yet the people who made this dessert seemed driven by kindness or perhaps simple routine. He couldn't tell which. Lieutenant Reed, in his office, wrote in his daily report, "Served ice cream to prisoners. No incidents. Reaction, confusion, laughter. Morale appeared improved." He hesitated before adding, "It felt oddly human." That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Reed made his usual walk through the yard. Some of the prisoners were working in the garden, others playing cards. A few were quietly sketching on scraps of paper, drawings of the desert, of home, of ships. Reed stopped near one of the fences where Masaru was sitting with a notebook on his lap. "Good evening," Reed said in English. Tanaka, the interpreter, followed, ready to translate. Masaru looked up, startled, then bowed slightly. "Good evening," he said carefully, his accent heavy but his tone polite. Reed pointed to the notebook. "You write." Tanaka translated, and Masaru nodded. "Yes." Notes of English words. "And thoughts. What do you think of the camp?" Reed asked, watching him closely. Masaru considered his words. "It is unexpected," he said finally. "Different from what we were told." Reed nodded. "That's good to hear." He hesitated, then added, "You like the ice cream?" Masaru paused. It was strange, but good, too sweet. Reed chuckled softly. "Americans like everything sweet, even war stories." Tanaka translated, and Masaru frowned, not understanding the irony. Reed waved it off with a smile. He turned to leave, but glanced back once more. The expression on Masaru's face stayed with him, a mix of curiosity and unease. He knew that something as simple as a dessert could unsettle years of belief, and that realization felt heavier than he expected. That night, Masaru couldn't sleep. The barracks were quiet except for the steady rhythm of breathing. He thought about the spoon, the cold, the taste that lingered longer than any meal he'd had in the army. He thought about the American lieutenant who spoke kindly, who laughed easily. None of it made sense within the world he'd known. In his country, surrender was shameful. Kindness from the enemy was supposed to be deceit. Yet here, the enemy gave them blankets, books, even a treat that served no purpose other than pleasure. He wondered if mercy could exist without motive. The next morning, the camp resumed its order. Work details began. Some prisoners were assigned to repair fences, others to farm duty. The ice cream became a small legend, whispered about like a miracle. Men who hadn't smiled in months now spoke of it as proof that the Americans were not demons. One joked, "If this is defeat, at least it tastes better than victory." Masaru laughed at that, surprising himself. It felt wrong to laugh, yet freeing. He started noticing the Americans more, their gestures, their casual manners, their lack of rigid hierarchy. The guards called each other by name, teased their officers, and never bowed. It was a different kind of discipline, one built on habit, not fear. During work hours, he was assigned to the camp library again. The librarian, an elderly civilian named Mrs. Anderson, had kind eyes and a soft voice. She offered him a children's English book with illustrations of American towns. "Maybe easier to read," she said gently. He thanked her, unsure whether to bow or shake hands. She smiled and waved him off, saying, "Just read, dear. That's enough." He carried the book back to the barracks and showed it to Kenji. They turned the pages together, studying the pictures. Children eating ice cream in parks, smiling beside fountains. Kenji laughed quietly. Even their children eat like kings. Masaru didn't answer. He studied the faces and the pictures, noticing something he couldn't name. It wasn't wealth, it was ease. The way they held themselves, carefree. He wondered if that was what freedom looked like. That evening, as the guards played baseball again, Reed sat on the bleachers, watching. The sky was painted in gold and red, the air still heavy with heat. Some prisoners stood near the fence, watching the game. One of them, encouraged by a guard, mimed a batting stance. The Americans laughed, tossing a ball toward him through the wire. He caught it clumsily, and everyone cheered. For a brief moment, the line between captor and captive blurred. The desert seemed less hostile, the war less distant. Reed felt it too, a fragile understanding forming in the heat, built not from orders but from moments like these. As night fell, the lights flickered across the camp, casting long shadows on the sand. Masaru lay awake again, listening to the faint music from the guardhouse radio. The melody was the same swing tune he had heard on his first night. He imagined his students back home hearing it, not as the music of the enemy, but as the sound of another world, one filled with light laughter and the strange sweetness of something cold melting too quickly to last. The memory of ice cream stayed with him, not because of its taste, but because of what it revealed. That the enemy could be human, that war could be stranger than he had ever imagined. He didn't know it yet, but this small, simple discovery would shape how he survived the rest of captivity. It would also haunt him long after he returned home, when peace would feel as foreign as that first spoonful of melting cream. For now, he closed his eyes, the night air cool against his face. Beyond the wire, laughter still echoed softly, and for the first time since capture, Masaru felt something close to calm. The war was far away, and tomorrow, he thought, might not be as cruel as yesterday. He didn't yet know that the sweetness of this illusion would soon be tested, and that kindness, like ice cream in the desert, could vanish faster than one could taste it. By the spring of 1944, the sun rose earlier over the quiet plains of Texas, spilling gold over the fences of Camp Hearne. Rows of wooden barracks stood in disciplined lines, guarded but oddly peaceful. The war was still raging an ocean away. Yet inside these fences, an entirely different kind of battle unfolded, one not fought with rifles or planes, but with identity, memory, and humanity itself. For Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, every morning began the same, a slow blink into the dusty light, the hollow ache of captivity pressing down, and a faint aroma of something unfamiliar wafting from the camp's mess hall. It wasn't the scent of rice or miso. It was sweet, creamy, and strangely inviting. Ice cream. The first time he saw it, he thought it was a trick. A guard had rolled a car across the yard, the metal tub frosted with mist, the contents glimmering white as snow. The American guard scooped it into small paper cups, laughing as they handed them to the Japanese prisoners assigned to the kitchen. Hiroshi had never seen anything like it in his life. To him, frozen milk was a waste, a luxury for people who didn't understand hunger. And yet, something in its simplicity, the idea that milk could become something joyful, fascinated him. Hiroshi wasn't alone in that curiosity. Among his fellow prisoners was Corporal Kenji Nakamura, a soft-spoken clerk from Yokohama who had a habit of sketching everything around him with a piece of charcoal and notebook scraps. There was also Private Takashi Ito, brash and skeptical, who joked that the Americans probably used ice to freeze the shame out of losing. These men had fought under the imperial flag, believed in the invincibility of the empire, and were now being offered frozen dessert by the very enemy they'd been told was barbaric. The Americans, for their part, treated it as nothing unusual. The camp cooks, many of them draftees waiting for reassignment, like sharing food. It broke the monotony. To them, feeding ice cream to prisoners wasn't an act of mercy. It was a habit of abundance. But for the Japanese soldiers, it blurred the lines of what war was supposed to mean. They'd grown up believing the enemy was ruthless. Yet here, the enemy smiled, offered second helpings, and played Glenn Miller records through the loudspeakers while everyone ate. The guards had begun a small morale program, film nights, sports tournaments, even English classes. According to U.S. Army records from that period, camps like Hearne and Fort Sam Houston organized educational activities to occupy the minds of prisoners and maintain discipline. What it really did, though, was humanize the war in unexpected ways. Prisoners who once viewed surrender as shame began to rediscover their sense of individuality. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the barracks, Kenji sat near the fence sketching the camp kitchen. He drew the ice cream churn, the guards laughing, the swirl of motion in the summer air. When Hiroshi joined him, he noticed Kenji's expression had softened, no longer haunted, just distant. "Do you think they do this to make us forget?" Hiroshi asked quietly. Kenji smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe they just don't know how not to share." It was a simple line, but it lingered. The next morning, when the guards handed out extra rations of ice cream to celebrate the 4th of July, Hiroshi hesitated before taking his cup. He'd always associated sweetness with childhood, a luxury of peace. He remembered his mother once giving him a piece of sugar candy during a festival before the war. The memory had faded under years of training and propaganda. But now, standing at camp under a foreign sky, it returned vividly. He tasted it. Cold, smooth, almost painfully sweet. His first instinct was to reject it, to spit it out. But then something broke inside him. He felt warmth, not from the ice cream, but from a flood of emotions he'd buried deep. The simplicity of that taste, milk, sugar, cold, felt like a whisper from another world. Around him, the other prisoners were quiet too, unsure how to react. Some laughed nervously. Others ate in silence, pretending not to care. Later, an American lieutenant named Robert Miller noticed the scene from a distance. Miller was young, barely in his 20s, and curious about the men he guarded. He'd read reports saying Japanese prisoners were unbreakable, loyal to the point of death. Yet here they were, savoring ice cream with childlike wonder. That evening, Miller wrote in his logbook, "They smiled today, not at us, but at something we gave them. Maybe it wasn't mercy, maybe it was memory." Hiroshi began helping in the camp kitchen soon after. It was partly duty, partly distraction. He learned how Americans measured ingredients, how they treated food not as fuel, but as comfort. He watched them joke about baseball, politics, even the war itself. Once, during cleanup, a guard named Johnson tried teaching and pronounced chocolate. Hiroshi's accent made the others laugh, but not cruelly. There was a strange warmth in that shared laughter, the kind that reminded both sides they were just men in the same heat, surviving the same sun. Outside the camp, the war's shadow still loomed. Radio broadcasts spoke of island battles, mounting casualties, and the distant threat of invasion. Many prisoners, especially the officers, refused to believe Japan was losing. They spoke of honor, of return, of revenge. But those who worked in the kitchens or workshops began seeing things differently. The abundance of American life, the wastefulness even, contrasted sharply with what they knew back home. Kenji once said, "We used to think dying for the emperor was glory. But maybe living, learning this, is harder." It wasn't defiance. It was reflection. The camp, in its strange way, became a mirror, forcing them to confront what they'd been told versus what they saw. The ice cream became a symbol, not of surrender, but of awakening. Each time it was served, it stripped away a little more of the distance between enemy and human. The guards noticed too. Some began leaving small gestures, newspapers, pencils, even magazines, near the mess hall for the curious prisoners. They called it cultural exchange. The prisoners called it strange kindness. As summer deepened, Hiroshi's role in the kitchen expanded. He helped mix the ingredients, cranked a hand churner, and served the desserts during special occasions. Sometimes, when Americans weren't watching too closely, he'd taste the mixture mid-freeze, the flavor sharp and bright against the dry air. He found himself thinking less about escape and more about what awaited them after the war, if there was an after at all. Yet not everyone felt that way. Takeshi grew bitter, accusing Hiroshi of forgetting Japan. One night, he confronted him outside the barracks, his voice tight with anger. "They make you eat like them, laugh like them. Soon you'll think like them. You think ice cream makes them kind? It makes them conquerors who can afford to be kind. Hiroshi didn't answer right away. He understood the pain behind Takeshi's words. For soldiers raised on honor and sacrifice, kindness in the enemy was unbearable. It forced them to question everything. Finally, Hiroshi said softly, "Maybe kindness isn't a weapon. Maybe it's what we were missing." The words hung between them, fragile and heavy. Takeshi turned away, muttering something about weakness. But deep down, he knew Hiroshi was right, and that truth frightened him more than captivity itself. As the summer faded, rumors spread that some prisoners might be transferred north. There was talk of more lenient labor, of education programs, even of letters being allowed home. The ice cream cart rolled out less frequently as supplies shifted to war priorities, but its memory lingered. When the last batch was made, the entire kitchen crew, prisoners and guards alike, paused for a photograph. Something rare, something dangerous even, but permitted for morale. In the photograph, later archived at the camp museum, Hiroshi stands near the churn, his expression calm yet thoughtful. Behind him, Johnson grins broadly, one arm resting on the churn handle. It's a strange image, the captor and captive framed by the same moment of shared humanity. That night, after lights out, Hiroshi lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The sweetness of the day still clung to his tongue, faint but undeniable. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of the sea or home. He dreamed of cold cream turning to ice, of laughter echoing to the barracks, of barriers melting not by force, but by something gentler, something almost impossible in wartime. Outside, the cicadas hummed under the Texas moon. The guards on patrol passed by, their boots crunching softly on gravel. The war would go on. More men would die. More battles would burn across the Pacific. But here, in this strange oasis of contradictions, something had shifted. The men inside the fence were still prisoners, yes, but prisoners who had tasted a piece of another world. And somewhere, deep within each of them, a quiet truth had begun to take root. That even in captivity, humanity could be found, not in grand speeches or victories, but in something as small and fleeting as a taste of ice cream on a hot American afternoon. By the time the winter of 1945 settled over Texas, the war that had once seemed endless was gasping toward its conclusion. Rumors whispered through Camp Hearne like a restless wind that the Allies had taken Iwo Jima, that Tokyo was burning under waves of bombers, that the Emperor himself might surrender. For the Japanese prisoners, the news was both relief and ruin. The world they'd fought to preserve was crumbling, and no one knew what waited for them once it was gone. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka woke each morning to a silence heavier than the guards' footsteps. Even the ice cream churn in the mess hall, once a symbol of quiet reconciliation, sat unused in the corner, its metal pail under the cold light. Hiroshi had grown thinner, but calmer. The kitchen work had shaped him, not his body, but his perception. He could now tell which guards were homesick by the way they stirred their coffee, which were newly married by the way they smiled at letters. In captivity, he had learned something the war had hidden, that enemies were just men wearing different uniforms. Yet that understanding carried its own burden. The more human the Americans became, the more inhuman his memories of war felt. Corporal Kenji Nakamura continued sketching, though his notebooks were nearly full. His latest drawings were softer. The camp at dusk, shadows long and kind, faces no longer hard with defiance. Private Takeshi Ito had changed too, though he would never admit it aloud. He spoke less, watched more. Sometimes at night, he joined Hiroshi behind the barracks, where they sat in silence and listened to the faint hum of the American radio drifting through the wind. Jazz, swing, sometimes a news broadcast in clipped, confident English. It was foreign, but it carried a rhythm of life they'd almost forgotten existed. Then, one morning, word came that a group of prisoners from the camp would be sent home. The announcement fell like thunder through the barracks. Some wept, others laughed in disbelief. For many, Japan no longer existed as they remembered it. Their families might be gone, their towns erased. Hiroshi's name was not on the list. Neither was Kenji's. But Takeshi's was. When the guard read it aloud, Takeshi froze, the words hanging in the air like a verdict. That night, He came to Hiroshi's bunk and sat without a word. Minutes passed before he spoke. "I don't know what to tell them when I get there," he said quietly. "That we live better as prisoners than as soldiers?" Hiroshi didn't look up from his hands. "Tell them the truth," he said. Takeshi shook his head. "The truth shames us." Hiroshi turned then, his eyes steady. "The truth frees us." Outside, the camp lights flickered against the fence, pale and ghostly. The silence between them stretched until Takeshi finally muttered, "You sound like them." "Maybe they sound like us," Hiroshi replied. The next morning, as the departing prisoners lined up near the gates, an American guard, Lieutenant Robert Miller, stood watching. He had learned fragments of Japanese over the past months, enough to exchange polite words. When Takeshi approached, Miller offered him a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, the kitchen crew laughing around the churn, sunlight washing over them all. It was the same photo Hiroshi had once been in. "Souvenir," Miller said, smiling faintly. "In case you forget we weren't all bad." Takeshi stared at the picture for a long moment. Then he gave a short, awkward bow. "I will remember," he said in broken English. As the trucks rolled out, Hiroshi felt a strange ache in his chest. Part pride, part emptiness. The war was ending, but something inside him was still unfinished. Days passed. The guard seemed more relaxed now. The fences less guarded, as though the entire camp were exhaling after years of tension. On August 15th, the announcement came to the radio. Japan had surrendered. The camp fell silent. Even the Americans stopped moving. A few prisoners dropped to their knees, hands trembling. Some wept openly. For Hiroshi, the words echoed like distant thunder. Surrender. It was what every Japanese soldier had been taught to fear most. And yet, standing in the middle of the camp yard, he felt no shame, only an overwhelming wave of confusion and release. Later that evening, Lieutenant Miller approached the kitchen. "You can rest tomorrow," he told the prisoners softly. "No more work detail." Hiroshi nodded, though he hardly heard him. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the soft rustle of the Texas wind, and thought of home. Not the home that might no longer exist, but the home inside him that he was beginning to rebuild. 2 weeks later, as preparations began for repatriation, Miller invited the remaining kitchen crew for a final gathering. It wasn't official, no flags, no speeches. Just a few guards, a wooden table, and something cold waiting in a tin tub. When Hiroshi saw it, he stopped in his tracks. "Ice cream," Miller grinned. "Figured it's only right to end how we began." The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. It felt almost absurd, this gesture, this sweet punctuation mark at the end of so much loss. But then Kenji laughed softly, breaking the tension. "You Americans," he said, "you fight wars with dessert." Everyone laughed, including the guards. Hiroshi accepted his cup quietly, his fingers trembling slightly as he held it. The same cold sweetness, the same scent of milk and sugar, but it felt heavier now, as if it carried all the memories of the past year within it. He took a spoonful and closed his eyes. In that moment, he saw it all. The battlefields, the faces of comrades lost, the slow transformation of fear into understanding. He thought of Takeshi on the truck, of Kenji's sketches, of Miller's awkward kindness. He realized then that the real victory was not who had won or lost a war, but who had managed to stay human through it. Kenji handed Hiroshi a small page torn from his sketchbook. It showed the camp gates opening, the men walking out, the ice cream cart in the background. "For when you go home," Kenji said, "so you don't forget how strange peace looks." Hiroshi smiled faintly. "Strange," he echoed, "and sweet." When the final transport orders arrived, the camp emptied slowly. Barracks that once buzzed with whispers grew quiet. On the morning of departure, Hiroshi walked through the mess hall one last time. The churn was gone, the tables bare. He ran a hand along the wall, where sunlight fell in narrow stripes. For a brief moment, he heard laughter again, not the sound itself, but its echo in memory. Miller met him by the gate. "You heading home, Sergeant?" Hiroshi nodded. "If home still exists." Miller extended a hand. It was a simple gesture, but for both men, it carried the weight of everything unspoken: regret, gratitude, understanding. "Good luck out there," Miller said. "You deserve peace." Hiroshi hesitated, then shook his hand. "We all do." As the truck rumbled away from Camp Hearne, the fences receded into the horizon, their sharp lines dissolving into the open plains. Hiroshi watched until they vanished, until the camp became nothing but a memory. One built not of barbed wire and command, but of small mercies, unlikely friendships, and a single shared sweetness that had somehow survived the war. Months later, in a rebuilding Tokyo, Hiroshi stood before a small shop window, displaying something he'd never seen there before: American-style ice cream, now being sold to curious crowds. Children pressed their faces against the glass, giggling as the vendor scooped vanilla into cones. For a moment, Hiroshi felt his throat tighten. He stepped closer, bought one, and took a slow bite. The same cold sweetness. The same reminder that even in devastation, life found ways to taste gentle again. He thought of Kenji, perhaps sketching somewhere far away. Of Takeshi, returning to a home changed beyond recognition. Of Miller, maybe back in Kansas, telling his family about the quiet Japanese sergeant who learned to make ice cream. The war had scattered them all, but bound them too, not by victory or defeat, but by memory. As he finished cone, Hiroshi looked up at the evening sky, streaked with soft red light, the kind that always meant endings and beginnings. A group of children ran past him, laughing, holding melting cones in their small hands. Their joy was unburdened, innocent, untouched by the things he had seen. He smiled faintly. "So this," he murmured, "is what peace tastes like." The wind carried the scent of sugar through the streets, light and fleeting. For the first time since the war began, Hiroshi felt something close to contentment. The ghosts of battle would always remain, but now they stood further back, softened by time and by the simple, enduring sweetness of that impossible memory. A taste of ice cream in an American prison camp, and the quiet, unexpected mercy that had survived the worst of humanity. And with that thought, he turned away from the window and disappeared into the evening crowd, one man among millions, carrying the faint, unmelting truth of what it meant to be human. If this story moved you, if it made you see history a little differently, don't forget to comment your thought below, and subscribe for more untold moments from World War II that history almost forgot. Your support keeps these stories alive.